Power in escort work is often described too simply. People say the client has the power, or they say the escort has the power. But power in paid intimacy is not something one person owns. It circulates, it shifts, and desire is what moves it. Desire shapes attention. Desire shapes behavior. Desire shapes what people are willing to give. And when desire is introduced into an exchange involving money, power becomes fluid, contextual, renegotiated moment by moment. As creator of the Psychology for Escort framework and the founder of Psychologists for Escorts, I help exceptional women understand the psychological impact of their work. This episode is about how power moves, not in theory, but in lived psychological reality, where control feels stable one moment and suddenly shifts the next. Power becomes hard to see when money and intimacy intersect, because money feels concrete. You can count it, you can measure it, and desire feels subjective, emotional, less visible. But in escort work, neither operates alone. Money grants access, it opens the door. It creates the structure of the exchange. And desire gives that access meaning. It turns contact into something emotionally important. It brings longing, expectation, hope. It's what makes the interaction feel charged rather than neutral. Without money, there would be no transaction. Without desire, there would be no emotional charge. And it's the combination of both that creates power dynamics. Power in paid intimacy emerges between money and desire, not inside either one. That's why it's sustainable. It shifts with mood, with expectation, with attention. That's why it is contextual, negotiated moment by moment. Sometimes the escort holds more control, sometimes the client does. And often it moves between them. This movement is subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It happens through tone, through emotional response, through what is given and what is withheld. And because it's subtle, it's easy to miss. Earlier in this series, we talked about the fantasy of control. This is where that fantasy begins to unravel. In paid intimacy, power can appear balanced at first. There is a clear exchange, money for time, access for payment, and on the surface, this can feel like equality. Both sides agreed, both sides benefit, but payment doesn't only compensate. It also sets conditions. It creates expectation. Expectation about availability, about responsiveness, about emotional tone. And expectation introduces leverage. For the escort, this often creates a double experience. Authority on the surface, pressure underneath. As an escort, you may appear composed, confident, professional, while internally tracking mood, monitoring reaction, calculating how much or how little is acceptable. This internal tracking isn't weakness, it's power management. Because when money meets desire, the interaction is no longer neutral. It becomes emotionally weighted. And emotional weight shifts balance. even when both parties agreed to the exchange. Power that depends on payment and desire is never stable. It must constantly be maintained. And this is where pressure quietly accumulates, not through confrontation, but through subtle expectation. The expectation to be warmer, more responsive, more emotionally available, and more sexually accommodating. Not because anyone demands it outright, but because desire invites it. And over time, that invitation begins to feel like obligation. Which is how an illusion of balanced power slowly starts to tilt. Money opens the door. Desire changes what happens inside it. When someone pays to be desired, they are not only buying time, they are buying an emotional experience. An experience of being wanted, of being chosen, of feeling significant. And that experience carries emotional weight. It matters. That weight changes expectations, even when nothing is spoken. Unmet desire doesn't disappear when it's paid for. It concentrates, it intensifies. And concentrated desire seeks reassurance. Reassurance that it's welcome, reassurance that it's enough, reassurance that is reciprocated. That reassurance is rarely asked for directly. It shows up subtly, in longer eye contact, in disappointment when attention shifts, in emotional cues meant to draw you closer. And because humans are wired for attunement, we respond to emotional signals automatically. This is not manipulation, it's nervous system communication. The body senses desire, the body responds. A response often means giving, more warmth, more presence, more emotional engagement, and often more sexual openness. This is where the structure begins to shift, because what started as a clear exchange now becomes emotionally negotiated. Not through contracts, but through atmosphere. When the emotional atmosphere intensifies, the boundaries feel heavier to maintain. Saying no feels sharper, pulling back feels colder. And so many women begin to soften instead, not dramatically, just slightly. A little more time, a little more warmth, a little more closeness. And over time, those small adjustments accumulate. What once felt like extra slowly becomes expected. This is how desire renegotiates power, not by force, but by emotional gravity. The side with greater emotional need begins to pull the interaction towards itself. An emotional pull is powerful because humans want to relieve discomfort, especially when we are being paid to create comfort. This is why power in paid intimacy is never fixed. It follows emotional intensity. And unless that movement is consciously tracked, it slowly reshapes the balance. This is where escort work becomes psychologically complex, because you are never in just one role. You are both the object of desire and the regulator of it. You are the focus of longing and the one who must contain it. You must remain desirable without becoming absorbed. You offer closeness while maintaining distance. You allow emotional projection without internalizing it. This is not intuitive. It requires structure. And that structure is what holds power in place. When you hold desire, you are holding intensity, longing, expectation. And intensity needs containment. Without containment, it spills. This is why escorts are not simply giving desire, they are managing it. They're shaping the emotional temperature of the interaction, raising it when connection is needed, lowering it when boundaries must hold. This is a constant adjustment, moment by moment. You hold power by holding desire, not by satisfying it. Satisfying desire fully would collapse structure. It would blur boundaries. Holding desire keeps the interaction stable, contained. And containment is not coldness, it's structure. And structure is what prevents power from leaking. When containment weakens, expectation grows, pressure increases, and the balance begins to shift. This is why emotional regulation is inseparable from power. Because whoever manages the emotional field is managing the direction of the interaction. Power rarely shifts through confrontation. It almost never changes in a dramatic moment. It shifts quietly, through small adjustments, through softened boundaries, through stretched expectations, through emotional availability that slowly increases without being consciously renegotiated. And because everything still feels consensual, the exchange often goes unnoticed. No one announces, "This is different now," but the structure suddenly changes anyway. One extra message, one longer moment of closeness, one additional emotional gesture. Each small accommodation feels harmless, professional, kind, but accommodation accumulates. It stacks, and what stacks eventually shifts balance. Power is often lost, not through pressure, but through accommodation. Not because someone intends to take more, but because the structure quietly allows it. When you give a little more, the baseline moves. What was once extra becomes normal. And what becomes normal becomes expected. This is how erosion happens, not by force, but by gradual adjustment. And gradual change is hard to perceive from the inside, because each step feels small, until one day the dynamic feels different. But no single moment explains why. This is why awareness matters. Not to accuse, not to blame, but to notice movement while it is still small. Because once power fully shifted, regaining balance requires much more effort. In earlier episodes, we looked at emotional labor and dissociation. Emotional labor regulates what you express. Dissociation regulates what you feel. Power management is where both are needed at the same time. It is where regulation meets containment. Managing power and desire at the same time requires constant tracking. Tracking tone, tracking emotional cues, tracking what is being asked and what is being implied. This is not suspicion, it's attunement. And attunement is effort. It requires attention, it requires emotional processing, and that effort repeats, moment after moment, date after date. This is why power management is labor. Not visible labor, but cognitive and emotional labor. Power management is cognitive and emotional labor. And like all labor, it accumulates. Not suddenly, quietly. Fatigue builds, reaction slows, presence starts requiring effort. This is where many women say, I'm tired, but I don't know why. Nothing happened that should feel this heavy, but I feel drained. That feeling is not weakness, it's load. The nervous system has been working continuously, regulating, containing, tracking. And when regulation becomes constant, rest stops restoring fully. This is why exhaustion appears, even when everything looks manageable. In the next episode, we look at what happens when boundaries are still present, but no longer effective. Because power in escort work is not something you possess. It is something you maintain. It lives in awareness, in structure, in how clearly limits are held. And maintenance always requires attention. Because when desire is paid for, control is never permanent. It shifts with emotion, with expectation, with what is slowly allowed. This is why power dynamics are not about strength. They are about structure. And structure fades when it isn't actively held. The question is not who has power, but who is still tracking it.